Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host. You know, for decades, for a century, every year, the petroleum industry has been pumping pollution into the atmosphere. And as a result, these days, 3.7 million people a year die from chronic or acute pollution-related illness. And that's something that we wanted to talk about in terms of how we subsidize the petroleum industry and what kind of changes we need to put in place in order to make renewable energy a realistic and easily achievable goal globally. So we invited Jack Kerfoot, who's the author of Fueling America, An Insider's Journey. It's about his 40 years of experience in the oil exploration industry, to talk with us about what he would recommend, not only to us, but to the new Biden administration as they come into office. Jack, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Very well, Mitch. It's a pleasure to be on your program. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming and joining us. First, having read through your book, it is really starkly surprising how much, essentially, money drives this industry, even though people don't understand the consequences or the complexities of the industry. What have you learned about how much people don't understand the economic advantages that are built into U.S. energy policy to support the fossil fuels industry?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, oil and gas or coal are all fossil fuels and they're not renewable. So as such, they are a commodity, and the price for the commodity will swing wildly. So when we talk about making the move to renewable energy, we have to recognize that the uncertainty for moving forward with the cost of fossil fuel is significant. I've seen oil at over $100 a barrel, and I have seen oil as low as $8 a barrel. And I've seen natural gas as low as 25 cents a standard cubic feet and as high as $26 a standard cubic feet. So up front, the economic advantages for renewables are better and lower risk than fossil fuels. But with that said, the dynamics of the oil and gas industry are, first of all, supply and demand. Before we had COVID, for instance, there was effectively another battle going underway for long-term oil supply and long-term oil contracts. And that battle was going on between Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, and the primary buyer was China. And so what they were doing were flooding the market with cheap oil. Mm-hmm. And so cheap oil that they're able to produce at high volumes at low cost. And they were undercutting the other producers. Their goal was to drive out competition from more expensive types of oil, like, for instance, the tar sands in Canada. Mm-hmm. It costs about $40 a barrel to generate a barrel of oil. Maybe it's down to 30, 35, but in that neighborhood, because it's basically mining. And then you have the fracking component of this aspect as well, and that's more higher cost. It's less expensive than tar sands, but it is certainly more expensive, probably double, sometimes triple the cost of a barrel of oil equivalent than, let's say, the oil being produced in Russia or Iran or Iraq, or traditional oil from that standpoint. So their idea was to drive down the price of oil and push out competition, which they thought ultimately would allow them to regain dominant share and gain long-term supply. For Russia, for Iran, for Iraq, for Saudi Arabia, oil is the primary source of their gross domestic product. We have that aspect as well. In the United States, we have different forms of tax advantages for different types of industries. The energy industry is one of those that has certain abilities to write off capital expenditures at a certain rate. From that standpoint, they have the advantages. Governments, the United States and all governments, typically look for maintaining the long-term energy supply and security. We have to realize that starting in about 1985, when the oil had dropped in 1980 gone from, let's say, $38 a barrel in 1980 down to about $8 a barrel in 1985, simply because there was an oversupply and supply exceeded demand. And so the prices dropped down very, very quickly. That was really about the time that governments around the world started investing in the national oil companies. And there were basically two types of national oil companies. One would be company or countries that were major exporters of oil, and they wanted to maximize the assets of the oil and gas reserves that they had.
And such as Saudi Aramco, for instance.
Saudi Aramco, it's also Norway. It is also Mexico, which is Pemex. In Norway, it was Statoil. In the Middle East, in the Far East, in Malaysia, it is Petronas. You also had countries such as Japan and Korea and China that were not major exporters but wanted to maintain long-term supplies of hydrocarbons, so they were out investing in oil and gas as well. Also liquefied natural gas from that standpoint. And that's where you really started to see the dominant types of oil producers change from the traditional big oil companies like Exxon, Gulf Oil, British Petroleum, and they switched over to the dominant national oil companies. And those are your major producers today of oil and natural gas. They are the national oil companies, not the British Petroleums or the Shells or the Exxons. So that was a beginning of the transformation. And with that, governments around the world started to provide subsidies. Perhaps the greatest cause for concern about subsidies is overseas, where about 60 to 70% of the countries overseas provide subsidies for fuel, different types of fossil fuels, whether it's heating oil or gasoline or natural gas. And these may be, most of these are actually developing countries, or they may be countries that are major exporters. But that basically encourages the continued use of hydrocarbons, which of course creates the demand, which of course keeps the price up.
Well, now let's talk a little more about, you talked about the direct cost of oil is between $35 and $40 a barrel right now, but that's what we pay for the oil. What about all of the ancillary costs, such as the health impacts around the world? What kind of, and of course, the fact that we fight wars over this stuff, what's the actual cost socially of a barrel of oil? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, that's one of the questions that the state of Oregon we're looking at as well. What's the social cost of carbon? And my first response is, what's the cost of humanity on the planet?
Yep.
Not to be flippant, but the answer is it's an infinite price. If we want to look at just from the fact of social impact, having lived quite a few of my years overseas and traveled extensively and lived in Southeast Asia and Asia, and traveled also extensively in the Middle East and lived in the Middle East and Africa and Europe, you have to recognize that pollution, air quality pollution, is toxic. World Bank studies estimate that in China, somewhere between 100 to 150,000 people die prematurely because of toxic air quality. I've been in major cities in China in the winter where I could extend my arm out and I couldn't even see the end of my hand because the smog was so dense.
Yeah.
And you have the same situation in India, the Middle East, in areas in Africa. And again, this is toxic air quality. And then, of course, the other factors we have are pollution into the water systems that we have as well. And that's also true of coal. I don't think people realize the toxicity of coal itself. It's not just the air pollution that we have in coal. It's also contamination of the spent coal, which creates coal ash. For instance, the EPA in the United States has documented over 40 different coal plants, both operating and closed, that the coal ash, which is supposed to be secured, has actually come in contact and flooded and gotten into the groundwater. And with that, it carries carcinogens, it carries arsenic, it carries lead, and it carries mercury. And the area of contamination is well over 100 miles from the plant site. So all forms of these toxic chemicals that we're injecting into the air and the water stream, all of these have long-term devastating impact on our environment and on our society.
Now, you also believe we can make the transition to renewables and that there are a variety of directions we can go. But in particular, you describe parts of the United States as sleeping giants of green energy. So first, what do you mean by that? And what regions are those? What regions are not taking full advantage of this opportunity?
Well, Mitch, the first thing I like to try and do is remove what I call fear factor from this transition. And I think it's important to recognize the move to green or renewable energy is just the next phase or chapter in the energy industry in America. In 1890, coal passed wood as the dominant fuel type, and coal mining states like Kentucky and West Virginia became major energy centers or hubs. And then in the 1950, oil passed coal, and so you had states like Texas and Oklahoma that became the new energy centers. To me, the next energy centers or sleeping giants that we have will be areas like, one would be Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. They have strong hydro, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, and geothermal resources that far exceed the current energy demands of the state and could easily be transported by power lines down to states like California. Mm-hmm. We have other areas, New Mexico, Texas, and Oklahoma, strong onshore wind and solar, which again far exceed their power demands, and they have major transmission lines in the states. In fact, Texas is the only state that has their own managed power system, which is one reason the state is the dominant leader in wind energy, because they manage the power grid so effectively, it's very easy for companies to tie in with new wind farms.
Well, so they had sort of pre-invested in renewables simply because of the way that they built their infrastructure.
Well, I would say Texas knows energy. Just to put it by perspective, when I look at Oregon, we've got maybe one renewable energy project that's sort of underway. It's a hybrid near the Washington-Oregon border. Mm-hmm. Just for the month of October, I counted over 10, probably it's closer to 12 or 13, new renewable wind farms or solar parks that are being built just in the month of October in Texas.
Yeah.
And the total output just for that month is over a gigawatt. And another area I would say that's really not getting a lot of publicity, but should, is the offshore Northeast. Offshore wind has been a major source of power in Europe for over 20 years. And there's a major building boom going on right now from Maine all the way down to North Carolina of offshore wind farms that are being built to replace old and expensive onshore coal plants and also replace nuclear power facilities off the East Coast. But primarily the focus of the big offshore wind farms are New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and that general area there.
So states, in addition to the federal government, have pretty deep relationships with the fossil fuels industry. What policies are preventing states from making these investments right now? Or do you think that's already starting to give way to just the simple practicality that wind is the next step? So?
We have to realize that public utilities, the first order of business, first of all, is energy security, maintain power to the customers, and then second of all, cost and economics. Now, when you bring in competition, then utilities will make the move to the lowest cost of power. On a levelized study, Lazard Bank started the first study in 2016, it updated 17 and just finished one in 2019. Mm-hmm. The cheapest form of power, taking out all subsidies, is onshore wind at about 5.2 cents per kilowatt hour. By comparison, the average cost of electricity in the United States for July of this year, according to DOE, is about 13.2 cents per kilowatt hour. So after onshore wind is followed by solar, which is followed by hydro, which is followed by natural gas, even though natural gas prices are low at this point in time. So the economics are there. And that's why oil and gas producing states like Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico have been making the dramatic move from oil and gas and coal to renewable energy. You've got states like Iowa that are 75, 80%. They have no mandated move to make to 100% renewable energy. They're doing it for the economic reasons from that standpoint. Now, there are a few states that have individually put in subsidies for coal, states like Kentucky, for one, and West Virginia, to try and maintain that energy the justification is for jobs. That's a false argument, but that's their justification. And in those cases, I think we're seeing heavy investment in the coal lobby to encourage legislators to provide incentives for their business.
So let me ask about the cost of a kilowatt hour when you send it across the country on the infrastructure. How do you see the markup that would be put in place by the grid for moving this energy, potentially shaping the cost curve, for instance, distributing Pacific Northwest generated wind or hydropower to the Midwest or to the Southwest? Does it make it impractical?
Not really. Like, for instance, in the case of the Pacific Northwest, there was a major power line put on from the Columbia River, from the Bonneville Power Authority, all the way down to Southern California, and that was put in the 1970s. The cost is about 2 cents per kilowatt hour for use of the transmission line for transportation. As a cost comparison, the average cost of electricity in Oregon is around 10 cents, 10.5 cents. I think Washington's about 10 cents, 9 or 10 cents. Mm-hmm. The cost of power in California, residential cost of power in California, is averaging around 19 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So transporting actually energy from Washington and Idaho and Oregon down to California, in theory, should actually cause their utility prices to go down, unless the state wants to put a tax on the actual power itself to encourage conservation. So those are other factors as well. Conservation, different states and countries have different approaches toward conservation. Many times they'll put a cost on there to encourage people to conserve power.
So could you provide an example of a green energy transition, a particular project that you would point out to a regulator or to a company thinking about how to accelerate the adoption of renewables?
Yes, because what's interesting is if I look at my state in Oregon, in the 1960s and 70s, we were at 100% renewable energy, predominantly was from hydro. But as the state grew in population and as the energy, per capita energy consumption increased in Oregon, our rates have actually dropped down. We've also had to scale back the amount of power from hydro projects as well because of the salmon. So now we're about 75%. But I've done studies on our state looking at just Oregon itself, how much undeveloped wind energy potential we have, both onshore and offshore, how much solar energy potential we have, how much geothermal. My estimate is conservatively, and I've checked this with our Department of Environmental Quality in Oregon, and their estimate is I'm probably being very conservative, but somewhere between 750 and 800% of our annual power requirements could be met by renewable energy. So it's not a question of having renewable energy resource potential. The question then is, what are the barriers? And in the case of Oregon, we've passed some laws that make it very easy to tie up permitting for power lines or even the site for a new renewable energy site for extended periods of time. And in fact, most of the cases we're talking about 15, 20, or 25 years to get all the permitting in place.
Sure.
So that's a huge barrier from that standpoint. Now, that's Oregon. That's the worst case. Now, the best case, let's move to the state of New Jersey. New Jersey, they had a new governor that came in 2 years ago, and he wanted to streamline and encourage the development of offshore wind. So he sat down with utilities and with also the companies that were proposing to build the offshore wind farms, and they went through the whole process. And the first thing they did is they said, well, instead of having sequential permits, we have offshore marine permits and impact on the fisheries, impact on tourism, stability of the soil, geological studies relative to bringing the power lines on. He goes, we can do this in parallel. We don't have to do this sequentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so he also brought together the different permitting groups or different periods of time that people could have an issue or raise a concern or discuss the issue or challenge, raise an environmental concern. So it brought all the concerns together in a short period of time that could be worked in a collaborative manner together. Now, reports I've read, that has knocked off. Initially, they were saying they would have first power to New Jersey from offshore wind by 2025. They're now talking about, even with COVID, having first power by 2021 or at latest 2022. So when you talk about something that's a $3-4 billion capital investment and you can knock off 2 or 3 years, that's a huge savings in cost to the project. And as a result, they're able to sign or provide power purchase agreements for power at much better prices. Now, what I understand, or what I've recently read, is a power purchase agreement from offshore wind, which most people think is cost prohibitive, is now in the neighborhood of about 5.5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So we have to realize that's a major breakthrough from that standpoint. And the reason offshore wind is important, winds are more consistent and stronger offshore than onshore. So a small difference in wind speed, like 14 miles an hour to 16 miles an hour, means the wind turbine can double its output capacity, which means more power, and more power in a shorter period of time means the consumer prices go down.
Well, and I've noticed just in the last week, the International Energy Agency put out a report on the current state of power, and the forward contracts, the purchases of that future power generation are up 15% in renewables and dropping across all the fossil fuel categories. So there's clearly evidence that this is going on and this is a real move. But let me ask a question about COVID, because you mentioned it a moment ago. How has the pandemic, do you think, changed public perception of the reliability of our current system, both economic and the energy grid? Are people paying more attention to this problem now, do you think?
I think that the first 3 months of this year, when everything virtually shut down with business and transportation, people were staying at home. In large cities areas, you could smell the difference in air quality.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So that's without question. I remember coming back, I was overseas, and I came back to the United States maybe 6 months after the United States had mandated the use of unleaded gasoline, and I could smell the difference in air quality. It was cleaner air in large cities and population. So that factor is there. We know that as a factor. Now, the other thing to compare is actually looking at power changes between coal, oil, natural gas, and renewables between the first quarter of 2019, January, February, March 2019, to the first quarter of this year, January, February, March of 2020. Well, what's interesting to see is with COVID, of course, you would expect a drop in demand. You did see an 8% drop in the demand for coal, about a 6 or 7% drop in petroleum, and that's primarily for transportation, so we understand that.
Right.
And then we saw probably a 1% drop in natural gas. It's cheap, but what people didn't realize, and this comes back to fossil fuel, is when the price of natural gas drops to a certain level, or what happens is that producing gas field is no longer economic. So it's shut in. If they're operating at a loss, they're going to shut it in, close it down, and sell off the equipment to get whatever revenue they can get. So a lot of times we actually saw that 1% drop in natural gas was because the supply wasn't there. And then renewable energy actually showed a 1% increase in demand because one was cost and two reliability because of supply versus the irregular supply of natural gas.
Now, the other function of the pandemic has been that COVID is distracting us from a lot of what is going on at the policy level, and there have been major changes in U.S. environmental policy, mostly enacted by the Trump administration through executive orders during this time. Is COVID distracting us at this point from the problem of planning and moving to a sustainable economy?
Well, unfortunately, I think it is, because to be fair, we've got to recognize we're talking about a disease that probably is well. You would have to go back to the Spanish flu around 1918 and 1920, and a few people were around at that time to recognize something as devastating as what we're experiencing right now. And we still don't fully appreciate the long-term impact of COVID. Yes, some people will contract it, and yes, some people will die, and some people will survive. But we still don't fully appreciate the long-term impact of COVID for people that have contracted the virus. So yes, it's on the front page, and then throw in the fact that we've got had a presidential election from that standpoint. I think the mind can only focus on so many things at once, and those were certainly, shall we say, the most polarizing across in our country, topics across the country. So it did take away from discussions about renewable energy. The policies that were going on in states and new programs were going on, we're still proceeding on, obviously at a different pace because of COVID restrictions. So you have states like Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico, all the way up to the Great Plains states, that we're still going through a very, very active building program of new renewable energy projects. But it does point out one factor, is that when we talk about making the move to renewable energy, it's not a red or a blue or Republican or Democrat policy. Right. It is basically good, compelling economic and environmental sense. So occasionally I'll meet a climate skeptic, and they want to argue about the theory of climate science. And they've already made up their mind. So that's an argument I don't get into. But I simply start off by asking them the question, do you like to save money? And I haven't had anyone say no to that. So we'll try and focus on that aspect and broaden the argument to help people understand the numerous compelling reasons to make the move from fossil fuels to renewable energy.
So let me ask that question in another way, too. If the United States doesn't lead the world in clean energy and China does, what are the consequences for the U.S. role in the global economy from your perspective?
Well, from my perspective, the first thing that happens is that our cost per power is high, and so it makes our ability to manufacture products more expensive, and that makes us less competitive in the world, and we lose the number one ranking as the global economic leader in the world. Now, to be fair, we have to recognize one thing. A transition already began, what many people don't recognize, that in 2005, oil was about $60, $70 a barrel, projected to go higher. And so the federal government passed bipartisan legislation, the 2005 Energy Act, which provided a range of subsidies to try and secure energy and provide incentives for nuclear, for fossil fuels, and also for renewables, fossil fuels, and nuclear, to increase the security for energy in our country. In 2005, 51% of our power was from coal, and 4 or 5% of our power was from renewables, predominantly hydro. 2019, April 2019, 15 years later, coal has now dropped down to 22%, projected to go even lower over the next 5 to 10 years. Right. And renewables had increased to 23%. Wind is projected right now to increase from just today from about 7% to 20% by 2030. And solar is projected to increase to be 15 to 17% by the DOE by the end of this decade, by 2030. So what we're seeing is a major change, and it's being driven by economics. So businesses, if they want to stay competitive, they'll make the move and want to make the move to renewable energy. And quite candidly, they are. You're talking about companies like Microsoft, Walmart, Costco, Macy's, Ford, General Motors, AT&T, that are all going out signing 15, 20-year power purchase agreements with solar parks, wind farms, get dedicated power to their projects wherever they're operating. The same thing with even smaller companies with distribution, massive distribution, like Starbucks from that standpoint. So it's an economic reason that's making businesses pay attention and make that move. Now they'll wave the green flag, but the green dollars and cents are encouraging them to make that move and make that commitment.
So it sounds like you think we can lead the world. We simply haven't galvanized the will to do so.
We have led the world in the development of oil and gas exploration around the world. There is no reason. We have the renewable energy resources that would dwarf Europe, and Europe's total population is larger than ours. And to be honest, we have those resources. We have the technology. We just need to put together policies to streamline and help us implement and make this transition and transform our energy system from a fossil fuel system to a clean, green, reliable, low-cost energy system.
So let me ask a final question. If you had 2 minutes with President-elect Biden, what advice would you give him right now about accelerating renewables adoption?
The first question is, would you like to save our economy and reinvigorate our economy without causing any capital investment from the federal government or the taxpayers? And the answer to that, by implementing a revised 2005 energy policy, you can reinvigorate our economy in a dramatic way we have not seen in perhaps 100 years. As an example, we've seen right now, just to put things in perspective on jobs, there are about 54,000 people employed in the coal industry. 32,000 of those are actually in the mines. But in 2019, there are over 120,000 people employed in the wind industry in America and 245,000 employed in the solar industry, either on projects themselves, wind farms and solar parks, or installing the solar panels from that standpoint.
Yeah, and those jobs pay 25% better than the other jobs.
Those jobs are and they don't go away. Unlike the coal, when the coal mine is out, the job is gone. These jobs stay there forever. As long as the winds blow and the sun shines, they are there. And they're good paying jobs, and they drive down the cost of energy, which makes us more competitive on a global market scale. It's good for the voters, it's good for the economy, and it's good for our country. And another aspect as well, which people really don't discuss, is if we make that move, or when we make this move to renewable energy, we will be energy independent. We will not have to rely on the import of any fossil fuel again, which is the first time since about 1946 or 1947. So we have energy security, we have low-cost energy, we have clean air, clean water, and we have permanent jobs in America as opposed to oil and gas fields overseas.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop the conversation for now. But Jack, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
Mitch, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Folks, that's Jack Kerfoot. He's the author of Fueling America, An Insider's Journey, which details his decades of experience as an executive in oil exploration. Check it out. And we will be back with another Earth 911 interview soon. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host. Folks, take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and let's take care of the planet.